Greetings, friends, and welcome to the opening plenary session of the 2021 Chisholm Annual Gathering. My name is Mike Riedinger. I'm the President and CEO of the Council for Health and Human Service Ministries of the United Church of Christ, Chisholm. I'm pleased to introduce our session this afternoon featuring Caitlin Curtis as our keynote speaker. Before we hear from Caitlin, I want to thank Chisholm member United Church Homes Incorporated for sponsoring this session. And here is a word from United Church Homes.
Hello, I'm Ken Daniel, President and CEO of United Church Homes. Welcome to this year's Chisholm Annual Gathering. Like all of you, we've been on a journey together. Our ministries have been challenged like never before, and yet we know we have friends and colleagues around the country that we count on. This annual gathering is special in many ways. Let it be a bridge to a time when we can get back together in person. Let it also be a time when we can celebrate the hope that we've brought to our residents and clients who have counted on us to be there for them throughout this very challenging year. I know that it'll be a time for us to enjoy the fellowship that makes Chisholm so unique. And I look forward to making some new friends along the way. So thanks for being here.
Thank you, United Church Homes, for all you do and for your support of this session. I'm excited to now be able to introduce Caitlin Curtis, who is a poet, author, and public speaker. Her most recent book is Native: Identity, Belonging, and Rediscovering God. Curtis is an enrolled citizen of the Potawatomi, a federally recognized tribe of Potawatomi people located in Oklahoma. Curtis also grew up in the Christian faith. She writes and speaks about the intersection of indigenous spirituality, faith in everyday life, and decolonization within the church. We welcome Caitlin Curtis here today to help us begin exploring our theme, Together in Hope. After Caitlin's presentation, there will be time for a question and answer session and discussion. You are welcome to enter your comments and questions in the chat during the presentation, and then we'll have an opportunity to interact more afterwards.
Hi, everyone. I want to thank you so much for having me here with you today. I'm so excited to be a part of this with all of you. So as we begin, I just want to take a moment. Let's just center ourselves. So wherever you are, whatever you're doing, just take a moment to kind of center into the place where you're sitting, center into your space, center into the land that you are on. As we do this, let's just take into account the indigenous peoples who have tended to the land that you currently live on. Ask yourself, who are they? How can you learn from them? I live on the land of the Abenaki and the Wabanaki peoples here in Vermont. And it's important that to know who we are, we take a moment to learn from those who came before us. And to learn about those who are still tending to the land that is around us. As we sort of center into this space, I want to open with a poem from my new book, Native. This is a poem from the very beginning of the book, just to kind of give us a second to breathe as we begin. Before there was everything, there was nothing. But before there was nothing, there was something. Something other, unbound, beyond, above, mystery. No one could grasp it then, and no one can grasp it now, not even with these realities coming among us and creating something new, day in and day out, despite our dry and weary bones. Because before us there was everything, and before everything, nothing was something, and something was the beginning, and we are just dust from its long, flowing robe. So again, I want to say miigwech. Thank you so much for having me here with you. Like I shared a moment ago, the land that has been cared for by indigenous peoples for centuries is sacred. I encourage you to visit a website. Maybe someone can put it in the chat later. The website is www.native-land.ca. native-land.ca. And on this website, you can discover who the original peoples of the land that you live on were, or what tribes still inhabit the land that you are currently living on. You can learn a bit about the history of the peoples in your area so that you can then go and learn more. You can learn their stories of survival and resilience, their stories of trauma, their stories of loss. May we become educated about the things that are important to them, about current issues that are still affecting Indigenous peoples. We're gathered here today to explore a few ideas from my book, Native. We'll be talking about storytelling, about the power of searching for the truth in a society and sometimes a world that wants anything but the truth. We'll be talking about why telling our own stories and our collective story is so important, and we'll be talking about what it means to have hope. So my book, Native, was really created out of my journey of going inward, going into myself, into my own story, into my own experiences. It was a difficult journey. We cannot heal until we discover the wound, right? And naming our trauma is part of this process. And so naming these things is going to open up some wounds. Maybe it'll provoke you to think about some things. And I want you to write those things down, throughout my talk today. If there are things that come up, please take note of them. I want you to know that that's holy work and that we're in this together. So based on the first few sections of my book, Native, this talk will draw on the importance of storytelling in our society today. It also examines what it means to practice collective belonging while asking what it means to begin again in the face of a future that feels really unsure a lot of the time. So Native is broken up into 5 sections: beginnings, searching for meaning, the struggle for truth, working, and bearing fruit in a new world. The Potawatomi flood story is sort of the story that I use to guide us through this process of, asking who we are, searching, struggling for the truth, working to honor that truth and our place in the world, and then seeing this new world emerge within us and around us. And so my book came out kind of towards the beginning of the COVID pandemic, but it came out a few months into this. And, I still believe that the flood story speaks to this time that we are living in. It speaks to our deep inequities that have been exacerbated by COVID, that will lead us to some really difficult but important conversations about what a future America and a future world should be like. So I want to tell you a little bit from the flood story. So in the flood story, Creator has flooded the earth. So everything is buried in water. There's nothing left. And original man and a few animals are sort of floating around on a log. They're just out there floating. I imagine that they have been grieving for a while and that they're sort of ready to begin again. They're ready to have a new world, right? And to make changes and to see what happens in that new world. And so they realize that they have to go down to the very, very bottom of the water to get some dirt if they want land again, right? And so a few of the animals decide that they will try to go down to the water. So they volunteer. So big animals, strong animals, animals that swim, none of them can do it. They're just having a really, really hard time. And finally, the muskrat, who, is, part of the rodent family. Not anyone you'd expect to be extra brave, have this courage to save the world. Muskrat says, I'll do it. And so they're like, okay, good luck. And so Muskrat goes down and it's gone for a long time. And finally, you see those bubbles and Muskrat comes back up to the water and Muskrat has died trying to get down to the bottom. But what they see in Muskrat's paws is some dirt. And so they pry his paws open and they thank Muskrat for the sacrifice of getting this dirt for all of them. And then the turtle volunteers his shell. And so they take that dirt from the muskrat and they place it on the turtle's back. And that is how we have Turtle Island. And so, some of you have maybe heard of that before, that we call this land Turtle Island, and that's part of this story. So that's a little bit of the flood story, and I talk about it in Native. And so it helps us ask a lot of questions. What does it mean to begin again? What does it mean to grieve what has been lost and to dream of a new world, right? So I want to read you a little bit from Native. No matter who we are or where we come from, we are people who journey. We long for community. We long for oneness with the sacred. We long to be seen and known and to see and know the world around us. Part of the human journey is knowing what it means to grieve, to celebrate, to get lost and be found again and again. If it weren't so, we wouldn't be human. And to be human is to know the journey of transformation, to know what it means to change and become, and often to step back into who we were before. In my life, journeying has meant telling the truth, coming to terms with the trauma in my own story, leaning into the trauma and pain of others with honest listening, so that together we learn how to be people who walk alongside one another in order to heal. And these words are important ones for us today, especially that last part I just read, that part that says, leaning into the trauma and pain of others with honest listening, so that together we learn how to be people who walk alongside one another in order to heal. So we have to figure out how to be honest about what it means to search for the truth. We are living right now in an America that is coming to terms with who we are, and it has not been a pretty process. To be human is to be able to transform. So what about our collective consciousness? Can we transform and journey together as a collective? Can we heal together as a collective? We have to be honest about our own stories, about our own trauma, about the collective stories and the wounds that we are dealing with every single day. But as William Wordsworth once said, to begin, begin. And I share this in the introduction of Native. We start at the beginning. We ask questions along the way. We arrive at ourselves. Mystery is always there. And then we start all over again. And so I want us to understand that contrary to what we are often taught to believe, life is not just a series of beginnings and endings in a straight timeline, right? We live in cycles, cycles of the seasons, cycles of life, cycles of birth and death and rebirth. I want to read you the essay that it's at the very beginning of Native, because it's this story about, what I call an epiphany, one of those moments when things were opened up for me, right? And I was able to name something that I hadn't named in that way before. It was sort of my beginning, so I want to share that with you. Indigenous bodies are bodies that remember. We carry stories inside us, not just stories of oppression, but stories of liberation, of renewal, of survival. The sacred thing about being human is that no matter how hard we try to get rid of them, our stories are our stories. They are carried inside us, they hover over us. They are the tools we use to explain ourselves to one another, to connect. We cannot take away the experiences of others, but we can learn from them. We can take them and say, what's next to make the world better? What's the next step in recognizing the sacredness of this place that we've been given? I often wonder if we underestimate the power of epiphany. Many indigenous cultures seek wisdom, the Great Spirit, or even the spirits of our ancestors, those who have gone before us through visions and dreams and prayers, through the gifts given to us in this world. This idea of longing for a vision or learning to listen to our ancestors is often lost in American society, within modern American Christianity. But what if God still speaks in dreams and visions? What if mystery still comes to whisper to us while we are still, while we are begging for a new beginning? Some of us might call those moments revelations, that time when the light bulb turns on and we suddenly see what we did not see before. Perhaps those revelations are spiritual and we are just recipients of sacred whispering, heard simply because we are longing to know more. That's how it happened for me, at least, one cold January day in Atlanta, Georgia. If you hike at various places throughout Georgia, you'll see these tiny signs along the trails, pointing to the original peoples who spent generations on the land. And in the grace that only the land can give, she has held me, a Potawatomi woman, and has reminded me of who I am. So after living in Atlanta for a few years, our family went hiking at Sweetwater Creek, which is this beautiful spot of land near a long, steady stream of water surrounded by rocks. and the ruins of an old cotton mill that was burned down by Union soldiers in 1864. Before that, before a history of African enslavement and years of white supremacy encroaching on this land, southeastern tribes inhabited the space, living along the shores of the creek before they were forcibly removed from Georgia during the Trail of Tears. So while hiking there with my partner Travis and our 2 sons on that cold January day, I had this epiphany. This moment when the lens of my life zoomed out and I saw truly for the first time what Potawatomi people once experienced. A history of forced removal from Indiana into Kansas with something called the Trail of Death. In that moment, I was reminded of the women who walked that trail, nursing their babies along the way. It was about 660 miles. And just as I stood there nursing my 1-year-old son in the middle of a wooded area with the trees breathing over and around us, there, standing over crinkled wet leaves, I suddenly understood what it meant to be Potawatomi. Growing up, we said we are Potawatomi, but those words did not carry weight in my life. We didn't name ourselves as Indigenous people or citizens of a nation, living into our resilience. But that changed as I got older, and I have more fully come to understand that I am Indigenous. I belong to the land as others belong to the land. So I felt in that moment the weight of my entire body center down into my feet. It was as if my steps were in slow motion, engaging with the pulse of the earth in every movement. I suddenly understood that ancestors sometimes come to us in the oddest of ways, and mystery speaks to us when we are least expecting it. So there, with 1 son by my side and 1 at my breast, I knew that the journey ahead of me would be different than the one behind me. That is how epiphanies work, after all. We got back into the car that day and drove away from Sweetwater Creek. And while Travis drove, I pulled out my journal and I wrote. I wrote about those women who spoke to me. I wrote about what it might mean to embrace a part of me that had been silenced for much of my life. Silenced by a culture and a country that says being Native doesn't really matter, or that all Native Americans disappeared from the face of the earth like dinosaurs. I wrote for my own children, out of a desire for them to know who they are at the young ages of 1 and 3, so that being Potawatomi might mean something to them. I wrote about hope and about that new beginning birthed along the edge of a creek on a cold summer day, a hope that transformed the entire world right before my eyes and brought me back to myself in a way that I'd never known was possible, that brought me to the reality of a God who sees and gives us the gift of seeing. So I shared earlier that it's important to remember the people who originally inhabited the land we live on. But that has to take us even further back. Can we use our imaginations to ask what it was like when the lakes and the rivers, the mountains and the pebbles were first created? Can we dig deep into our childlike curiosity and ask how the earth began in its own sacred way? This is where the importance of storytelling comes into play. Searching for the truth means that we're honoring our beginnings, we're honoring our stories, and we're using those stories to ask questions. So for me, I used that moment in my life at Sweetwater Creek to go on a journey of transformation. A journey of digging deep into my own story, into my identity, to ask who I am and what I need to be speaking into the world. And it began a really difficult journey. It's not been easy, but I believe it's been necessary for me. It's one in which I learned to sort of integrate all the parts of who I am. And I believe that all of us are in a space to ask these questions about our identity, our experiences, our stories. So let's talk for a little bit about why storytelling is so important and how it ties into these sort of examinations of our beginnings and our identities. So I love definitions, and so I'm going to give you a few today. Here's the first definition. The definition of story is this. It's an account of past events in someone's life or in the evolution of something. An account of past events in someone's life or in the evolution of something. So there are 2 ways in which storytelling is really important, as it is a part of our lives. First is telling our own story, and then second is telling the collective story that we are a part of. Now, I love this definition of the word story because it speaks to our capability of evolving, right? The ways in which we transform throughout our lives. Throughout time, cultures have used stories to remember, to send future generations on with hope and courage. Over the last few years, storytelling for me has become this sacred work of telling the truth of my story. You know, I was born into a mixed culture family, white and indigenous parents. I was born into a Christian home. But as an adult, I'm looking into the stories of my people so that I know who we really are, where we come from. We are the people of the Great Lakes region, the people of the place of fire. And when I began telling that part of my story, learning our people's stories, I began learning for myself what it means to be me. I began to transform, to evolve, to listen to parts of myself that had been shut off for a long time. I began to understand what it means to face my own trauma, my own pain. I began to name things so that I can heal. And it isn't easy, but that is the way our stories work. They are hard and messy and beautiful. So I encourage you at some point today or in the coming days to take a moment and just spend some time with your own story. Do it with a friend where you process that together. Do it alone. Just sit with your own story for a little while. I would encourage you to do that. So this is part of my own story, my beginning, these pieces of what I write about in my books, in my poetry, in my online publications. These are the stories I come and tell people like you, because our stories are the things that connect us, right? Even when our stories are riddled with trauma and pain, even if they're completely different, we take stories and we weave them together and they form this masterpiece that others can enter into. The ripple effects of our life stretch throughout time, throughout generations, throughout experiences. So we care for ourselves, we care for our spirits, we nurture our ways of knowing and experiencing God so that we can go out of ourselves and lean into community. So, an important thing to consider then, even about our own story, is this question: what are our stories rooted in? What are our stories rooted in? Are they rooted in love and solidarity and connectedness? Are they rooted in hate? Are our stories plagued with things like colonization and white supremacy? Well, if we live in America, the answer to that one is yes. Just as we remember our own creation stories, we have to remember the creation story of America. That this is a nation that was built on the backs of indigenous and Black bodies. An America that has abused some and upheld the sure success of others. So even our personal narratives have been affected by systems of whiteness and hate. And our work is to own and understand those stories inside of our bodies. That is where the hard work begins. Our storytelling involves deconstructing and examining the systems that we grew up in. The 7 grandfather teachings are these teachings from my tribe, and they sort of, are used to call us back to the important and central tenets of our culture. So humility, honesty, wisdom, bravery, truth, love, and respect. So in other words, through these teachings, we get to work out the meaning of what it means to be human, of what it means to have this identity. We are taught to carry these gifts in the right way, with the right heart, to honor the earth, to be humble, to be kind to the people that we encounter along the way. And so the deeper I lean into these teachings, the more I find this interconnectedness among all religions and faiths and cultures all over the world. Our work, our collective work, is to call each other home, to call to one another's spirits and say, this is for you. This is what it means to be human, to be loved, to love others. Let's learn from one another as we go. So in living a holistic life, I engage in a holistic faith in which I can't compartmentalize or separate out the various parts of who I am or what I believe, which means that journeying must include all of me, all of us. If we were to engage in this way of belief for ourselves and those around us, we would see that God is in our midst. We would understand that the Spirit is one of inclusion within our cultural boundaries, but also one who calls us out to so much more outside of that, to see the lives and experiences of others as beautiful and necessary aspects of our collective wholeness. So, what is the role of storytelling in community? We talked about what it means for us, but what does it mean in community, connected to the whole? It's to preserve culture. It's to help us heal. It looks like the work of justice. It looks like educating ourselves to become better people, buying books by a diverse set of authors. There's this beautiful book that my friend Deneen edited and wrote called Holy Troublemakers and Unconventional Saints. And it's a children's book, but also, wonderful for adults, as most children books are. And in this book, Deneen is sharing stories of faith leaders and activists who have sought after justice. And it's all sorts of people. It's such a diverse set of people's stories. There are people who resist, who pray. Resisting hate means telling the world's stories to our children and telling the stories of the Bible from the view of the oppressed. And I think of James Cone, who was the leader of Black Liberation Theology, distinguished professor of systematic theology at Union Theological Seminary. His work reflected the important practice of storytelling in community, of bringing the voices of the oppressed together to speak to our Christian faith. And I watched him in an interview once, and this is what he said, and it's always stayed with me. I read the Bible from the bottom. I read the Bible from the bottom. This means we tell the stories of the ones who are forgotten. Resisting hate within our families and communities means that we choose to tell a better and truer story. And I think about Jesus, who was a storyteller, who came and told a different kind of story. His parables tended to turn things upside down, made sense of things that no one was expecting. He had people looking in the opposite direction that everyone was searching for meaning in. Jesus spoke to the communities of people that surrounded him with stories that brought the small and the forgotten and the oppressed right to the center. That's how communities are transformed. That's how we are transformed today. We ask whose voices we have been centering. Voices of whiteness, voices of patriarchy, hate, and greed. Can we decenter those voices and center the voices of the prophets of our time? Author Barbara A. Holmes says in her book, Race in the Cosmos, this is what she says. We are participating in ways that support systems of oppression. The strength to walk away, to make those radical changes and commitments cannot come until we understand who we are and why we are so deluded by the myths that we help to create. This is where we find ourselves today. This is facing the truth of who we are as individuals, who we are as a nation of oppressive institutions. Our stories matter. The stories we tell ourselves, the stories we tell about one another. Can we speak the truth in our stories? Can we trust the prophets and the truth tellers of our day to lead us? I hope so. But it begins here with us. I want to read to you a little bit more from Native. We believe that God is one of a kind, but beyond that, we can't name what or who God is exactly. Mystery, other, sometimes father, sometimes mother, sometimes neither, sometimes friend, sometimes challenger. When we begin to name God, we find that God has suddenly become an image of us, our own cultural surroundings and understandings. The conversations begin with where and how things were created, what the environment looked and smelled like, who was present, how exactly Adam got to name the animals, or why the turtle was the one to create land from the shell on his back. And so we rest there a moment, and we take in the reality that whatever was used to create the world, the Big Bang, the little spark, a breath, a snap of the fingers, the spit and the dirt, it began in the most sacred place. Our creativity comes from the creative energy within that mystery. And through that, we have life today, a constant beginning. And that beginning leads us throughout our lives, through every adventure, every misstep, every celebration. Returning to our collective and personal creation narratives means asking difficult but essential questions about what we are doing on this earth. I think that the trees have a lot to teach us about what it means to be kin, what it means to honor the work of creation. I'm reminded of the idea behind Peter Volhaben's book, The Hidden Life of Trees, that trees have social networks. Their roots are connected to one another, and they support one another through sickness and health. He says this, their well-being depends on their community, and when the supposedly feeble trees disappear, the others lose as well. So trees demonstrate community. They understand what it means to care for one another, to care for the whole as they care for themselves. As humans, we are all connected at our root base, and in our struggle to learn what it means to be human to one another and to care for this created world, we are constantly exchanging experiences with one another, good medicine with one another, stories and relationships that are born from the deep well of God. But sometimes we forsake that sacred knowledge, and instead we trade violence and oppression and fear with one another. So on the one hand, healing begets healing, community begets community, but on the other hand, oppression begets oppression, and hate begets hate. So we must choose what kind of people we want to be for the sake of all of us. That means that our cultures must be intermingled in these relationships, even from the very beginnings of who we are, because we are responsible to and for one another, and responsible to our faith traditions, whatever they may be. So today, let's invest in our stories, in our beginnings. So as we think about our stories, let's talk about what it means to bear fruit. In the Potawatomi flood story, there's this moment when the muskrat has brought up that dirt from the bottom of the water, and Original Man and the animals have taken that dirt and they've laid it on the turtle's back, and they are beginning to ask, what is the world going to look like? What's it going to be like when we start all over again? Bearing fruit means that we look ahead with hope and with expectation. We spoke about the difficult truths of naming our own stories, naming how we are connected to the whole story of all of us as humans. And now we're sort of looking to the truth tellers to help propel us forward. I want to read you the very first essay from a section of my book called Bearing Fruit in a New World. And as I read, just think about the ways that you want to bear fruit in your world, in your community, in your family, in the world around you. Latasha Morrison began Be the Bridge in 2016 as a space for the church to foster conversations on racial reconciliation and justice. When our church in Atlanta announced that it was participating, I joined right away because I was hungry for conversations on intersectionality and truth-telling, especially within the church context. So over the next few months, a group of about 12 of us met to share our stories, led by our leader, Zach, who facilitated the conversations. The people of color in the room shared their experiences in America. I shared my experiences as an Indigenous woman. We became close, not because we have a lot in common, but because we gathered for the purpose of listening, making room, testing the status quo given to us for so long in America and in the church. Intersectionality as an idea was discussed as early as 1892 by Anna J. Cooper, a Black liberation activist and educator. The term intersectionality was coined more recently in 1989 by Kimberly Crenshaw, who is a pioneer of critical race theory, and she gave a TED Talk on this subject. So this is how she defines intersectionality: the complex cumulative manner in which the effects of different forms of discrimination combine, overlap, and intersect. So Crenshaw's work focuses on the intersection of race and gender, and on how race and gender overlap to disenfranchise Black women. She says this: we have to be willing to bear witness to the often painful realities that we would just rather not confront. And what I see in these expressions is the invisibility of Indigenous women in America as well. I learned in my Be the Bridge group and from the Black women in my life that Black and Indigenous women must work together, partner together, and actively join with other women of color to lead the way forward in America. Intersectionality brings us together because Black women, Indigenous women, other women of color across the spectrum are ignored, mistreated, or called angry for speaking up about basic human rights. So bridging the gap means having more conversations on intersectionality within our churches and communities. It means men stepping down and women stepping up to tell our stories. Anishinaabe writer Leanne Simpson says this: for me, engagement with the theories and practices of co-resistors is powerful because it often illuminates colonial thinking in myself and demonstrates different possibilities in analysis and action in response to similar systems of oppression and dispossession. I am reminded of my friend Daryl, a Black pastor in Atlanta, and my good friend Amina, an incredible poet and writer. We meet for coffee every now and then, and we discuss the ways in which our identities overlap and differ. And those conversations bring us solidarity. They help us remain willing to do the work necessary to make justice happen, especially within the church. In America, Black people, Indigenous people, other people of color, and religious minorities have run out of time. There is no more time to tiptoe around conversations, no more time for white people to say this isn't who we are. There is no more time for Indigenous bodies, women's bodies, two-spirit Indigenous bodies, trans bodies, sick bodies, Asian bodies, disabled bodies, or Black bodies to be attacked, and for everyone to misunderstand why it happened. This is the America we know and have always known. History tells the story, and if we can't gather in a living room to tell the truth and listen to one another, we will never gather in the streets or in our churches or in our political spaces to ask for change. It must begin with our experiences, with our words, with our bodies, and lead us to a better way forward. We are in such an important and prophetic time right now. History, repeats itself, and oppression, unless truly ended, will just continue its vicious cycle. So we are encountering yet another cycle of oppression in America. Police oppression and brutality being put on display. We are looking to people who speak the truth. We are voting and electing new leaders. Some of us are new to this journey, and it can be intimidating and scary. Some of us have been telling the truth for a while longer, and we are grateful for those that are coming alongside us. I have so much hope when I look to the people who are telling the truth, even when it's hard. Friends of all religions and races and cultures naming injustice and practicing solidarity. It's so important. And we have to remember it's not a fad. This is work that is meant to last. It is lifelong work. It takes time and energy to keep it going. So what is solidarity and why is it important? Here's another definition for you. Solidarity is this. It is unity or agreement of feeling or action, especially among individuals with a common interest, mutual support within a group. So in 2021, what is our solidarity rooted in? What is the common interest that we're trying to hold on to? Is it that Black lives matter? Is it that America needs to face its own history? Is our humanity itself our common ground? Is our belief in God what brings us together? Is it our sacred breath, the breath that is taken too soon from some of us by violence and hate and police brutality? So I want to stop here for a moment and talk about decolonization as a tool for dreaming and imagining a better way forward. When COVID began happening and so much of the world was sort of catching up to disabled and immunocompromised people who were warning us of this danger that was happening, we began to understand that the world was not going to be as it was before. And so as Native was being released into this COVID world, into a world where hard truths about America were coming to the surface, I realized that it was exactly the time it needed to be released in. The world needed to be reminded of a flood story, of a story about beginning again. We needed to hear about the animals and original man doing what they could to create a new beginning in a world that was scary and unknown. We needed to be reminded that the stories of the oppressed matter and that they always will. We needed to be reminded of the importance of community. Decolonization can literally be referred to as a state withdrawing from a colony. I use decolonization as an everyday tool in leading people to examine what colonial systems they're a part of and how they might envision breaking down or dismantling colonization around them. So as we think about this, how do we widen our understanding of what it means to be human? Can we decolonize our communities, our homes, the books we read, the things that we watch, the people we listen to? Can we listen to those who have been marginalized and in doing so change ourselves and actively become part of making this world a better place? I want to read you something that Indian author Arundhati Roy said in a recent article, and it's something I've carried these words with me throughout all of COVID. They're beautiful and raw and so true. This is what she says. Whatever it is, coronavirus has made the mighty kneel and brought the world to a halt like nothing else could. Our minds are still racing back and forth, longing for a return to normality, trying to stitch our future to our past and refusing to acknowledge the rupture. But the rupture exists. And in the midst of this terrible despair, it offers us a chance to rethink the doomsday machine we have built for ourselves. Nothing could be worse than a return to normality. Historically, pandemics have forced humans to break with the past and imagine their world anew. This one is no different. It is a portal, a gateway between one world and the next. We can choose to walk through it, dragging the carcasses of our prejudice and hatred, our avarice, our databanks and dead ideas, our dead rivers and smoky skies behind us, or we can walk through lightly, with little luggage, ready to imagine another world and ready to fight for it. So beyond COVID, we are asking, what will the world look like with our most oppressive selves laid bare in the midst of uprising hate? It's like we are in a flood. It's like we are beginning again. What do we imagine is on the other side? A world where Black and brown children can play freely. A world where queer and trans people are accepted and loved for who they are. A world where disabled people aren't controlled by ableist laws and ideas. A world where women can speak without patriarchy and misogyny taking over our words or silencing us completely. So we choose to have hope, because those who came before us never stopped dreaming of a future, and here we are, dreaming as well. As I was growing up in the evangelical church, one of my pastor's favorite scriptures to use to sort of, wake up the congregation and remind us to keep going was this run the race scripture, right? In Hebrews 12, we are instructed to run with perseverance the race marked out for us, fixing our eyes on Jesus, the pioneer and perfecter of the faith. But I was never a good runner. I still hate running. And I needed a different metaphor. I needed something else to sort of propel me forward, something that I felt would teach me to carry on my faith in a sustainable way. And so the metaphor that seems to fit for me is the idea of a burning fire. As Potawatomi people, we are the people of the place of fire, the Potawatomi and Tao. And I think of this, one of my favorite quotes from Rumi. Rumi said, "Stay in the spiritual fire, let it cook you. Stay in the spiritual fire, let it cook you." So the long haul work of justice, of making things right in a world where things have gone wrong, this work of decolonization, it is work that lasts throughout the centuries. It is the work of keeping that fire burning, of letting it cook us. As prophets, we recognize that the dreams we work toward probably won't be realized while we are still living. Perhaps prophets realize that our children and grandchildren and great-grandchildren, our foster children, our students, they are the ones who carry forth the work that we could only hope to finish. They are the ones who will realize the dreams of God in a hurting world. And so the question is how? I've read to you from my book about some of the prophets and the truth tellers and the activists. How do we dream of a better world? How do we have hope when things seem so hopeless? I want to talk about 3 ways to keep hope. Now, hope, I'm using hope, this word isn't meant to be a shallow feeling or a belief. It's meant to be a deep-rooted reality, sort of an embodiment, even when things are hard. So, 3 ways to embody hope. Number 1, keep expanding your circles by decentering whiteness. Number 2, return to the earth again and again. And number 3, practice radical self-love. So 1, keep expanding your circles by decentering whiteness. Number 2, return to the earth again and again. And 3, practice radical self-love. So first, we expand our circles by decentering whiteness. Now, this seems like it wouldn't create space for hope, but let's stop for a moment and understand that decolonizing or decentering whiteness, it's a gift. It's an invitation for everyone to learn a better way of being in this world. We are so scared to imagine a world in which white supremacy isn't the leader and the foundation that we don't understand the depth and the richness and the beauty of such a world. How it could be a gift for all of us and for the earth and for every creature on the earth. If we recognize how much systems of whiteness steal from everyone, we would do what we can to reorganize our spaces and our world. My friend Gabe Torres says this: being anti-racist, anti-colonial, and anti-capitalist doesn't only mean restoring our humanity in actionable and strategic ways, but falling in love with it again. This is exactly it. We get to fall in love with our humanity when we choose to widen our circles of understanding and solidarity to include those that white systems teach us not to include. So what does it look like to return to the voice of mystery in our lives? Maybe it's building relationships with those who are not like us. Maybe it's following people on social media who come from different racial or religious backgrounds and listening. Perhaps it means letting the earth speak. It always means asking how we can become people who love better. All of these questions challenge the status quo and ask us to look deeper, to widen ourselves. They are holy questions that bring hope. So let's keep asking them and let's not give up. Number 2, we keep hope in a heavy world and time by returning to the gifts of the earth. I have found myself reminding people, especially my friends that are Black, Indigenous, people of color, make sure you're drinking enough water right now. Water. Water is this holy gift, just as the land and the creatures of this earth are holy. When we go and place ourselves beneath the trees or on the dirt, we are learning what it means to be humble. We are undoing some of the lessons that white supremacy and capitalism have taught us, that the land is meant to be cut up and sold to the highest bidder, right? But when we return to the earth, we become students again. Lisa Dugan, who is the president and CEO of Invisible Children, says this: lasting change comes most assuredly when the oppressed are central agents in addressing the problems they face. So when it comes to the earth and the creatures around us, we should be listening. Because we have, as humans, have oppressed them, we should be listening to their voices. We should pay attention to the way the birds chatter on the power lines or their migration patterns in the winter. We should watch the ants work and remember that we are called to pick up heavy things and move them for the sake of community. We listen to the water as it runs in the creek. And if we desire to be people who love one another well, we have to begin with our creature kin, the ones who crawl and slither and swim and fly, the ones who are different from us, but who hold deep knowledge and incredible stories about this earth that we live in. Number 3, we find hope by practicing radical self-love and self-care. Now, self-care is this term that has been co-opted by consumerism, like so many other things that have deep meaning. Self-care isn't just having the means to go to a spa or to eat out or to binge watch Netflix for an entire day. Those things are all self-care and can definitely be self-care. But practicing self-care and self-love is actually a very revolutionary act that takes time. It's what I've been finding in therapy, the ability to not just name my trauma, but to find myself, to find my child self and my adult self, and to be gentle and honest with them both. So when we practice self-love and self-care, we find our place in a heavy and violent world. We become grounded in the individual work we have set out to do that affects all the people and the systems around us. So where do you need to practice radical self-love? I want to end with this question because I want you to spend some time with it. Where have you been missing yourself? Where have you been neglecting yourself? Making it harder to do the things in the world that you know you are called to do. Self-care is at the core of our desire to be healthy and to be whole and to be connected. But within these ideas of self-care are layers of privilege, of course. So what might be self-care for a middle-class woman in Beverly Hills is not self-care for a single mom in Chicago or a mother living on a reservation. Self-care is tricky, and we approach it with care and caution. Even so, it is necessary for the health and well-being of everyone that we practice self-care in a way that works for us. We consider all of this. We consider how our oppressive systems keep so many people from getting the care they need. Self-care is for everyone, to help us be more healthy humans. But to get there, we all need to be honest about how the system of self-care works for all of us. So we fight oppression and injustice from a well that is full. And I believe that then we can do these 3 things. We can expand our circles by decentering whiteness. We can return to the earth again and again, and we can practice radical self-love. All of these things will help us keep hope in a way that each of us knows how. And as we do that, we sort of draw the full picture. Returning to the flood story, when we work together to hope, we create the world we all need, just as the animals in Original Man did. And so we bear fruit in a world that is hurting, in a world that is violent, a world that tries so hard to silence the oppressed. We bear good fruit through our resistance. We bear fruit through the labor of hope that we never give up on. Our collective wholeness is always on the horizon. May we continue to journey toward that wholeness together. Beginning again means returning home, not just to the physical land of home, but home to ourselves. And that is a great gift that we give to the world. When we choose healing, when we choose to acknowledge all the parts of ourselves and each other, we become more whole. And again, none of this is an easy journey, right? But it is the greatest gift that we can give to the young people who will carry on this world after we are gone. We learn to love and know ourselves. We learn to love others well. We lean into our belonging, and when we do that, we help them do it. So let's remember that this journey of naming truth, of honoring each other's stories, of transforming, it's a constant and holy cycle, a constant beginning. So I'm going to remind you of this word from my book as we go. We start at the beginning. We ask questions along the way. We arrive at ourselves. Mystery is always there. And then we start all over again. Thank you.
Thank you, Caitlin. That was beautiful.
Thank you.
Good to see you in person again. And we welcome you to the Chisholm Annual Gathering. And just wanted to let everyone know we're going to open up the question and answer session now. And we're probably going to run a few minutes over from the 12:30 stop time Eastern. And we'll run into the reflection groups a little bit later. But Caitlin, your message was absolutely beautiful. And I was really thinking about your part 2 of the book, where you were talking about searching for meaning, and wanted to ask you somewhat like when we find those truths, horrifying and beautiful both, how do we use those truths to inspire us and lead us to faith and hope? And given everything else that you said about these, the historical trauma and the cyclical nature of hate, intimidation, and oppression, and then also the intersectionality of our shared stories.
Yeah, such a something that has just become such an important part of my life is this work of solidarity. Entering into things like I do a lot of like interfaith dialogue, and I found that whenever I began going into my own story, like I talked about, we have to realize that it's not just for me. My own story is not just for myself. It has to be part of our communal story. Now, it worked for me because I'm a writer. So the way that I process is through writing. So it just happened that way. But, the beauty of living in a world that has art is that we get to express our stories and share them with each other in all these different ways, and so for me, I use words and poetry to do that. I use music on a personal level, and I used to be a worship leader, and I used it to do that. And so I think that when we sort of transform our stories into outlets, into those pieces that we share with the world, we build hope and we build solidarity. I think it really is almost organic. And then the other piece of it, of course, someone was asking, like, how do we carry the grief? Because it is sort of all mixed in, right? How do we carry the grief of our stories, or the grief of America's story, for instance? And I think that when, after that time at Sweetwater Creek, it kind of coincided with the time of the Standing Rock. If anyone knows what happened, there was a pipeline going in, there were protests there, and I was just watching live feeds of this as I'm like trying to understand my own identity. And I found every day at like 3 or 4 o'clock, my body would just give out and I would have to go lay down. And I didn't know what was happening. I was like, am I anemic? Like, what's going on? And I realized that I was processing so hard and I was grieving and I was like, what's happening? That my body was like, you're done at like 4 o'clock every day. Like, you're done for the day. You can't do anymore. And I think that's part of our story too, is like giving ourselves the time and the space to process. Again, it's lifelong work. So as we share our stories with one another, like, it's not a linear timeline thing. And I think that finding hope in that is just being able to be honest and gentle with ourselves as we're sort of unraveling all of these things.
Beautiful. And I'm glad you got to talk about the grief question that Scott had mentioned in the chat room, because that was going to be my next question. The other thing that inspired me at the beginning of your talk was when you were talking about the muskrat and the turtle. And, in the world of our Chisholm member ministry, so often it is the muskrats and the turtles who are the frontline care providers, who are really doing the work that is really what sets us apart. And so I just wondered if you wanted to talk a little bit further about some of the symbolism of the muskrat and the turtle in your journey.
Yeah. So I didn't grow up knowing my culture's stories. I didn't grow up knowing any Anishinaabe stories. And so learning this story has just been really meaningful for me. And like I said, my book came out when COVID started. So really, having this flood story at the front of my mind, I couldn't have imagined a more opportune time for this book to come out, as we're really dealing with this question of what will our life be like, and even next year, even the year after, even in 2021. So and I think the thing that's just stood out to me with muskrat is that, again, this rodent, this creature in the rodent family that no one would necessarily think is a hero, and just knowing that there are people and creatures and beings out there that no one pays attention to, or no one would notice, and they're the ones who are doing this incredible work in the world. They're the ones who are being brave when no one expects them to be brave, and they may be even doing it quietly. And the other part is his sacrifice, the muskrat's sacrifice of his life to save everyone is really beautiful. And holding gratitude for those relationships. And then the turtle, giving part of his body for us and for the earth is such a beautiful way of, even for us to think about honoring that dust to dust idea, that we return to the earth and we're born from the earth, and that is always a part of who we are as humans. I think will always stay with me and guide me.
Yeah, beautiful. Thank you. Ken Daniel just asked a question in here about generational relationships and the role that elders play in our community. And I'd like to kind of tie that in a little bit with, when you were talking about honest listening and honesty and truth, and leaning into the pain of others with honest learning. I'm just wondering, how would you teach us to be better listeners and better learners, and is there a real tie-in generationally?
Yeah. Well, right now in the midst of COVID, we have lost so many of our Indigenous elders to COVID. And that's part of that, just the inequity of all of it, is that Indigenous populations and tribes have not been reached with proper care. And we've lost literally people who hold our cultures. Like, our elders carry our languages, and they carry our stories, and they care for us. And so that's been really painful to watch that happening all over the place, all over Indian country, and knowing that that's a part of the reality of who America is that we're losing it, and no one really understands what that means. But it's very heavy. So that's one thing I'll say. And then the other thing is, I view my life on a continuum of my ancestors, me, whoever comes after me, the future generations. And so in knowing that, my job right now is to learn and heal alongside and from my ancestors, and then to pass those stories on to my children, which means that there has to be active listening on both sides. Sadly, I don't have my grandparents. They died when I was young. And so I don't have those right away really close elders to go to. But I have people that I am listening to and learning from. And my hope is to pass that on to my children and teach them how to listen. And really and truly, I believe that the best way to start learning how to listen is to become humble in the way we listen to the earth, to sit literally to go sit under a tree and to be like, okay, you are my elder. You have been here for years. I'm very young compared to you. What can you teach me? And to actually sit and observe the earth as a humble creature, instead of we're humans at the top of the food chain, and so we get to, tell everyone else what to do. Like, what if we actually place ourselves low and listen? And like, what would that actually teach us about caring for other people as well? It would teach us a lot.
Beautiful. I think we probably have time for one or two more questions, but what occurs to me is that when we talk about the frontline workers, the muskrats and the turtles, and when we talk about our elders, the losses that we've had in people in our society, there has been really profound, and particularly with the elders, how do we recover that knowledge? And when we look at the title of your book, Identity, Belonging, and Rediscovering God, I just can't help but think that that's really, this loss that we're experiencing is part of, a reflection on the inequality and inequities in our society. And, we're going to try to emerge from these twin pandemics. Well, they're not twins, right. Pandemics of racism and the coronavirus. And we've had such great loss. And it's really pointed out the inequities and the problems in our society and systems going forward. So what do you have to say in terms of a lesson that we can carry forward again for hope?
Yeah. I will share one kind of activity that I've done with my children. We've done it because it kind of connects to the grief as well, because of the people we're losing, the culture we're losing, the truths about our society that are getting covered up because we're losing people, all of this. One day I did a little activity with my kids who are 7 and 9, and we basically had 4 or 6 candles. And we did a grief and gratitude practice. And so we lit the first 3 candles, and they were all for grief. And we named some grief. It could be personal grief. It could be collective grief. And we're just honoring, like, this is a really hard time collectively to exist as a human. Because we have to stop sometimes and, like, take in all the things that are happening right now. And then we blow out those candles and sort of release the grief. And then we light the next 3 candles and we name 3 things that we're grateful for. We breathe that in, and then we blow out those candles. And that's it. It takes, less than 10 minutes, depending on who you are. And it's a really powerful ritual because you could do it every day, and you could name different griefs and different gratitudes every day, because there's so many. You could name individuals you've lost. You can name parts of culture that have been lost. You can name those inequities, the racism, the white supremacy, and then you name the gratitude, you name the trees, and you name those moments of peace. And I think when we have those rituals, they just remind us that we can keep going, and that we can honor all the parts of what this time in history means, like honor how hard it is, honor the things that we still have, and then keep going in whatever way that looks like for us.
I really like the practice with the candles. That's a great idea. I would be inclined to use Snickers bars instead of candles, because I think that chocolate is always motivating. I guess we'll do one last question. A lot of this conversation, people are concerned that this is maybe a one-off event where we're emerging from these pandemics. And, so some of the questions in the chat room are, how do we allow this to really define us so it doesn't just be a one-off fatty kind of thing? Frontline workers are very tired. They've been beaten down for a year. Our elders are isolated and lonely and lost. We're all feeling overwhelmed. So how can we be inspired to continue this work going forward, and not just as we emerge from these pandemics, but as we emerge from whatever comes in the future?
Yeah. I think the main thing that I have come back to, and that I really try to remind people of, is that this is not just a fad. It's like that our work is lifelong work, because, I meet people and I know that they want to, they kind of want to get to the healing quickly, or they want to get to the next thing quickly. Can we just get through this? And that's not really the way time works. That's not how grief works. It's not linear. It's cyclical. It comes in waves. It kind of wraps around itself. And I think that if we can adjust our Western mindset to go back to that reality, because whether we realize it or not, we have been trained to think like this. We have been trained to think that way. if we can kind of readjust that life comes in seasons, that life comes in these movements. I really think that even just changing that will help us get through whatever it is we're going to go through. And I can't explain how important it is to think that way, because then we realize, okay, this work I'm doing, anti-racism work or fighting white supremacy or decolonization work or just helping people heal, that I don't have to get through it quickly. We need to be okay that it takes a long time, and that we'll pass the work on to someone else, and that they get to then carry on that work.
And that we never forget.
Yeah.
Well, thank you very much for your message. So in closing, Caitlin, just wanted to invite you to join us for the next 2.5 days as you are able. Hopefully you'll get to connect with our community in the networking sessions and in the chat room. We truly have appreciated your inspirational message today. And I would just ask if you could close with maybe like a short prayer that reflects on your Native and Christian heritage.
Yeah. This is a prayer in Potawatomi. It's the only prayer I know in Potawatomi, but has meant a lot to me since I've learned it. So let's pray. Miigwech mamogosnan. Jakshigego gagish doyen mina monogishgit. Owido daskiego mnop madzwin mina jitmowen. Mtino io enajmoyan. Io. Amen.
Amen.
Thank you.
Thank you very much for that, Caitlin.